Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Is being sent by the local church in a time of global connectivity and well-resourced, well-established sending orgs still relevant? We think it is, and we've invited Drew Remke on the show today to help us unpack this question. Drew currently serves as the VP of Church Partnerships with Pioneers International and comes into this conversation with prior experiences in overseas support-based ministry and stateside pastoral ministry.
Yeah, and we invited Drew to join us today because I had the pleasure of being part of a webinar that Drew led a couple of weeks ago. And the focus of the webinar was on church partnership. And, you and I, Andy, have kind of had this question rolling around for a while, or just really wanting to talk to our audience about the importance of the local church and being sent by a church. And in hearing Drew share on that webinar, I just thought he would be such a great guest to bring on for this topic. So Drew, we would love to pass the mic to you and let you fill in any details that our listeners need to have and kind of give us more context for the experience you're bringing into this conversation.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. Just really excited to share with you guys today. It's just some of the things I've learned along the way and some of the convictions the Lord has brought to me about the local church and its role of being engaged with supported people. I've lived on support, my family and I, for close to 15 years now. Most of that being while we're overseas, but now that I'm in a U.S. stateside role, we've continued in that form of funding for our ministry. And I think it's a real joy and a privilege to be able to serve the Lord in that way. And I think it's a unique space to walk into. So excited for our time together today.
Nice. That sounds like a great experience you're bringing to the table. What was something that brought you into this current role? What led you here?
So after 12 years of living in the Middle East, we decided it was time for us to come back to stateside for a while. We had some family medical, care to be attention to. We had kids that were, on the cusp of going to university. And so we said, hey, I think this is probably a time for a season in the U.S. And I had pastored previously before we moved overseas. I'd pastored a church while we were overseas. And so as I came back into the U.S., the leadership Pioneers said, hey, we'd love for you to consider taking this role as the vice president of church partnerships, because I kind of have the unique experience of the mission world and that type of speak, as well as pastoral world. So a lot of what I do is I'm the translator between the two parties there, between the missionaries and the pastors, and help them understand and each other and work together.
Between church and parachurch.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
great. Which I think is such a great experience to have kind of in both worlds, especially for this conversation. First, I just want to recognize that we are coming into this discussion with limited cultural perspective, the limitation being that this will be discussed from a North American point of view. So no doubt there are nuances and variations that may be different depending on your context or the culture that you're listening from. But just kind of with that caveat out of the way, Drew, I am curious, in a time when sending organizations in North America are very comprehensive in the support that they provide, be it healthcare, member care, training, spiritual formation, retirement plans, like kind of a full spectrum of benefits and resourcing, what role does the local church still play in sending?
That's a great question. And I think one of the first things that I would love to talk about is, when it comes to sending, my conviction is that the local church is actually the sender. And the parachurch or the organizations, they help facilitate that sending. So when it comes around to it, it's like we see this pattern in Acts 13. If you go back and read Acts 13, 1-3, that it was Paul, and Barnabas being sent out by the church in Antioch. And so that church, we can't move past it when we're seeing being sent to people. And there's certain unique avenues that an organization or a sending agency, as we refer to them as often, just can fill a role that the local church can fill a role the sending agency can't or can't do well. For example, I would say developing people in character. Character is developed over a lifetime. And pastors often know their church members, from when they were, in middle school or earlier, and growing through being a follower of Christ over a period of time is so valuable. The agency can bring in skills, but that character just takes so much more time. Next would be like Bible knowledge. Now, so many people that come through an organization, they do extra training, extra education when it comes to Bible knowledge, but being weaved into who we are, shaped and formed by Scripture, happens over a much longer period of time that a church can really go behind and feed into. Of course, there's finances, there's prayer at the local church we're involved with, but also home ministry assignments, or furlough, depending on who you're being sent through. Those are just a key place where the local church comes beside and they can care and support their people in a way that the agency can't. A lot of what people struggle with when they come on a furlough or home ministry assignment is they're saying, man, I've been shaped so much by my experience being in another country or in another city or wherever that city might be, that when they have that time off, the church can really provide a way for them to have space to sort through who they are, how God has changed and shaped them. So I think that's a really unique role for the local church. And then lastly, I would say that care and counseling in unique ways. Because our culture and who we are is deeply affected by where we come from. And though an agency might have a member development or a member care a department from within, there's certain ways that a church will know and understand a person because of knowing where they've come from that I think can't be overlooked. And the local church to engage and be a part of that part of the process of sending people out.
Yeah.
That's great. So what stood out to me is that it is really hard for an agency, a sending agency, to prepare fully someone for overseas service in just a brief kind of orientation and training period. No matter how long they have, if it's weeks or even like over the course of months, it's hard to compete with. And I think you want to compete, but it's hard to compare that with that depth of relationship and just knowing that happens in a church body. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's also probably hard for agencies to be dialed into the unique circumstances and situation in everybody's home city when they come home for a furlough or home assignment. Yeah, that's tough. Like, how do you know like the unique opportunities? And that feels really strategic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So conversely, what do you think is kind of the unique role of a sending agency then?
Yeah, I would say the unique role, other than, there's skill training. And so skill training could be from language to culture acquisition, to other types of skills, depending on the type of work that people are going to be doing overseas. There's other things like identifying fit for service. An agency is going to have a unique perspective of what is going to be needed and required of an individual in their field of service. And they can help work through kind of clarifying that call and even a place where they could serve that really utilizes their skill sets and maybe has ways to overcome some of their deficiencies or areas of weakness from within. So that's a unique vision that a sending agency is going to have in sending them out. Next, there's going to be field teams that are established. So when people are being sent out, a lot of people they're figuring it out. That's why they would, research would say, hey, the first 5 years that somebody is in service, they're less fruitful than after that because there's so much time it's just kind of adapting and figuring out how they can serve, what their best contribution is. And the field teams are a really effective way to kind of speed up that process because you're joining in a work that's already happening. sending agency really helps catalyze new people coming to the field by helping them to join in.
Mm.
So basically you're saying people don't just land into a context with nobody walking alongside them, but they land into a team, and that team is able to help them acclimate and
graft them in.
Maybe graft them in.
Yeah, grafting is a great example. I mean, some people are natural entrepreneurs, but I just don't think that's the way the Lord has made most of us. And it's helpful to be able to partner with those that have made some of these same mistakes already.
Right.
You can teach us along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Fast forward through some of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Then you could say care and counseling in a different type of way. There's a different way that a sending organization can provide care and counseling that a church might not. And there maybe when it's counseling with unique issues to, service in types of ministry, like, for example, often team conflict.
Yeah.
Dealt very well from an organization that the local church might struggle with that.
Sure. Culture stress, maybe.
Culture stress is another one.
Yeah.
That those are things that everybody goes through. And a church is like, I don't get it. You have high-speed internet. Like, what else do you need?
You have a VPN. Yeah.
Yeah. What's going on? Yeah. Do you need my Netflix password? I don't know.
Yeah.
There's other needs that come along with that. And then, of course, there's specialty skill sets that an organization has, like crisis management. Speaking with a team that they were doing really well, but they didn't have an organization, and they were sent directly from their fellowship. And then the country they were serving in became a failed state, and there was no more water or fuel. And they're like, what do we do?
Man.
And so where the organization tends to have a plans in place and experience in dealing with situations like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, it sounds like we've got some really great kind of categories for the unique care that each of these partners plays in sending. I'm curious, from your experience, what does it look like, or how does the local church partner with agencies? Like, ideally, what would that partnership look like?
Yeah, I think the key word is relationship. And that's kind of knowing one another. We like to refer to it as like a three-legged stool of the organization, the sending church, and the missionary. And so they all lean on one another, and without having one of those legs of the stool, it's not going to stand. So that usually revolves around knowing what the different strengths of the different partners have. And so that involves intentionality with communication to develop those relationships, to see where, hey, we're going to have to lead more towards the agency in this, because our church doesn't really have maybe a well set up system for helping people to grow in their Bible knowledge. But maybe the agency does. There's, obviously different ways in which it kind of just depends on each individual situation, which is why there's just a lot of intentionality that has to go into that relationship.
So what does that look like for Pioneer specifically? I mean, that's your context. How do you determine the uniqueness of every situation with every church and every missionary?
Yes. Yeah. So so Pioneers is a large organization, which is what makes it difficult.
Right.
I think a lot of times smaller organizations have a real advantage here. With Pioneers, we have 3,400 churches that send and support the people that work through Pioneers. So what we have done is we've created a team of 12, and each of those 12 will have there's a primary sending church to each worker.
Okay.
And our team tries to engage those churches multiple times a year. They try to be aware of what events are happening. Do they have a missions emphasis month, or what is the things that this church is passionate about? So that involves knowing not only who the pastor is, but also who the church mission leader is.
Yeah.
And that's where we kind of engage with a set of conversations with them from the very beginning, when their goer, contacts us to say, hey, we're calling the church into this relationship, and we want you to know what we're asking of the church. It's not just what we're asking of the individual. And the church has to be okay with that because they have to sign off on a sending church agreement form. We're saying, yes, we're agreeing that we're a part of this. Because the easy natural thing to do is just to say, okay, well, we've sent them to you. Good luck. The checks will come every month, we promise.
Yeah. Yeah.
My team's job is kind of raise a flag and say, hey, that's not what we want. And that's not what we think is too effective overseas workers. We want you guys to still be involved and engaged and to own the wins and mourn the losses.
Sure.
With your worker and, see, hey, how does our church buy into this vision as part of our church's vision as well?
Mm-hmm.
How often do you see churches that either push back against that or already have their own, like, oh, we already have this plan in place, like we're already doing that?
Yeah. I would love to say right now that, man, there's a lot of times that happens where the church has a plan and they have a vision. Usually not. Usually churches don't even feel like they're invited to the table.
Yeah.
And so we say, hey, we want you here.
Yeah.
We want you to be a part of this. You're not in the way. You're a way to help catalyze effective workers. And I think churches feel honored by that conversation. And so that's really helpful. Now, there are some churches that are fantastic that have a great, sending pipeline where they're raising up new people, they're training new people, they're sending them out. And for them, we're like, hey, that's great. You've got your thing going. We're not trying to tell you to change what you have. You have a system that works for you and you're engaged with your people. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
And we'll just check in to make sure any questions or things that arise in the process, but we're not going to make them change anything based on that. We just want to celebrate them and thank them for what they're already doing.
So I have a question as it relates to just kind of like the three-legged stool and hopefully, those three parties are communicating well, working in tandem, working together towards effective and fruitful ministry. I'm curious, when it comes to fundraising specifically, how do you see that being an area that all three parties are like invested in? Or do you see it playing out more where that's something that the church kind of sees as between the missionary and the sending agency, and they'll just let them know when they have need? Or I guess, how do you see those three parties partnering together to see God's provision for that ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is, some really helpful ways that the church can serve different, individuals as they are trying to raise up their funds for what they're doing, around the world. Like for example, a church saying, hey, we're going to commit our missions committee has met, we're going to commit X amount per month to them. In some ways, that's a stamp of approval from the local church on that. So when someone's raising funds, maybe there's people in the church that don't really know this person that's raising money, but they trust their leadership in their church. And if the church is saying, hey, we're behind them, that's going to help them to make a further step in their fundraising efforts. There's times where a church could say, hey, we'd love for you to go and speak to our community groups and bring in an invitation for them in. I think that's something that, we experienced in the past. And it was really helpful for saying, hey, the church asked if we'd come and share with this community group or this Sunday school class. And there's something about having this stamp of approval from the church that's a great benefit to those that are raising support.
Yeah, it sounds like being blessed to explore avenues for seeking partnership within the church, and then, having the church's kind of approval, like you said, or showing like, hey, we're behind this person. We would encourage you to consider this. Has your team ever engaged a situation where, I'm just thinking of people that we've worked with that are prevented from approaching people in their church for one reason or another because of central funding or special circumstances? I'm just wondering, like, do you have any tips on how to navigate situations where it feels like sometimes there are obstacles in facilitating conversations with people within the church? Like if the church has said, we're giving, you're not allowed to ask people beyond that. Have you ever experienced that, or do you have any tips for people in that scenario?
Yeah, I have seen that, and I've seen that there are some churches I know that have 20, 30 people overseas. And they said, hey, we have so many people here. We're all about what you're trying to do. We love you and your efforts. but our members have asked us to protect us from more people.
We're tapped out.
It's like the guy that is the business owner is like, on Wednesday, I meet with somebody for lunch every week, who's trying to raise support or those kinds of things.
Right.
Like, how do we overcome that? So there's different approaches to it. And there's different scenarios, on some it's like, hey, being a good sending church isn't always about the finances.
Right.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, praise the Lord that they're so invested in the work overseas that they've sent a ton of people. And if that means, hey, your financial model looks different from where your funding comes from, like I'd rather have a church that's deeply invested in the ministry than just financially.
Right.
Yeah.
There's others that I think they try to prevent people from raising funding because maybe they don't have a vision for the ministry that you're a part of. And I think that's a bigger and harder question to deal with. Is this the best option as a sending church for you? That there's people who said, hey, we're gonna pause and take 2 extra years from when we get to the field because we want to have a sending church that agrees with what we're doing, the work that we're doing, and it feels like it's going to be behind us.
Yeah.
So we've had people change churches, and I try to push back against it, but I get it. Those are hard choices to make. But if you're looking for them to be sending you out and they don't want to be sending you out, then maybe that it's not the best fit.
Yeah, that's tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a tricky thing to navigate.
Yeah. Do you feel like most people only have one church behind them, or maybe they have one sending church as primary and then they have other funding churches?
Yeah, so what we do in Pioneers is we say you have one primary sending church, and that's helpful for us when, say, things go sideways. You're in a country and there's a coup that happens. We need to know who's the primary church that we're communicating with in times of crises. But you can have a limited number of supporting churches. So, they support you, they fund you. Sometimes even they support you more than your sending church. Is often the case. But for the sake of authority, we looked at one primary sending church. I would say that our office, the kind of our finance office would say, in the past, it was normal that people had 7 to 8, supporting or sending churches.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And now it's, 2 to 3 is more normal.
Okay.
So there is I think there's been a movement in general for churches to say, we're going to support fewer ministries and support them better. So I think that's affected the total number of churches altogether.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to put you on the spot for a minute, Andy. So when you had your time overseas, I know that you were sent and supported by your local church, by the sending church. And I guess I would just love to give you an opportunity to speak to how impactful that was for you to have their kind of holistic support, for them to be very invested.
Yeah, they really got on board once they understood kind of the vision of everything. They were really kind of 100% on board. Even going to the extent of having a meeting with the president of my sending organization saying, what can we do? We want to be more invested. So they were really proactive in that. They encouraged us to form something called a Barnabas team, where we just went around to different people that we knew around the congregation and said, hey, will you be a part of this? Will you support us? Will you kind of be our wingmen as we are serving overseas? And we had a really strong group of friends, singles and couples and families that prayed for us regularly, sent us packages, helped us with logistics and a bunch of stuff like that. So we served, as you know, Heather, we served 2 tours. We did 4 years and then took a break and then did another 4 years. The second tour, we had this core team, this Barnabas team, and it was life-changing. It was 100% different to know that this group was so dialed in. And so when we came home or returned back to the States, it felt like everybody in the congregation kind of was already up to date. Like they knew us and they knew what would have been happening, and felt like it was really disseminated well, and we were really taken care of. Like we pulled into our garage and it was full of furniture and grocery cards and cleaning supplies, and it was fantastic. So is that something that you guys encourage? Do you have any kind of additional training or encouragement for churches to kind of put together something like that? support wise?
Yeah, we twice a year we have something called the Church Partner Forum, where we invite church mission leaders to come into our main office, and there you kind of walk through like, how do you send well? Not only how do you raise up people to go, but how do you care for those that are already overseas? And so some people call them Barnabas teams. I'm trying to think of the different names, advocacy teams, or another word that people would use. And so that'll come up in those conversations, because I think churches often want to be more involved and want to have people that really kind of own their missionaries and their work. And so I think those are great ways to do that.
Yeah. Nice. It feels like it needs to be less of a baton pass from one organization to another, and more of like, let's work together in partnership to get this person fielded well and cared for well.
Yeah, let's be sympathetic to the local pastor who says, "Hey, I kind of, I think if they're honest, to say I kind of like being able to just send people to an organization, not have to worry about it, because they have so much that's going on, right?
Right.
And the advocacy team or a Barnabas team really helps their workers to stay central in feeling cared for and loved and known within the church community and church congregation. So I think that's both loving of those you're sending out and of your pastor who's, has the responsibility for their missions program.
Right. Pastors already have a lot of hats they have to wear.
Yes.
And adding expert in this part of the world and in caring for missionaries is probably one more thing they don't need. Yeah.
Absolutely.
On that, I am curious, just from your own experience in the pastoral role, some of the questions we get often are just around how to approach churches. Maybe you're in a larger church not known by the leadership, kind of the best ways to approach being affirmed and sent by your local church. I'm just curious if you have anything to say from that perspective.
Yeah, I would say, I've sat with a lot of people who are wanting to serve in different contexts that are raising support. And first I would say, can you clarify the vision the Lord has given you? Can you speak to that, saying, this is where I feel like the Lord is leading me, and this is what I'm hoping to do? I think that it's really hard when someone is feel like, hey, we're going to raise support and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. It's hard to get behind it, because I think that as the pastor wants to get behind the vision that somebody owns. Second is, and I don't think people do this often, and I think this would be really helpful, but asking the church the question of what's the church's vision for other parts of the world, or, their non-local kind of ministry. And I think we often approach churches with this is what I'm doing and this is what you should be behind, and more saying, who are you as a church and how can I be part of fulfilling that vision by the work that I'm doing? There's, it's a small thing, but it's a very different approach to it. Like I had an individual who was looking for churches to connect with, and, bless him. Like the Lord had done some really great things through his ministry. And he was like, I need you to connect me with these different people. And, the church should want to talk to me because this is this great opportunity. And I was like, man, and if you're just telling the church what they should be, or it just doesn't go great.
Right.
Bringing a posture of just kind of respectfully listening and saying, hey, is this a great way that we can have a kind of a symbiotic relationship here where we can be a blessing to the church as the church is a blessing to us? I think that's a much better posture to take.
Good.
So from what you're saying, Drew, I'm curious whether ideally someone would start the conversation of partnering with their church to be sent before they've been accepted and kind of commissioned by a sending organization, or whether that's something that should happen after they've identified, who they want to be sent by or where they want to be sent. And I know that there's no formula. God sometimes works things out in really interesting ways, but I'm just curious whether that would ideally start talking with a parachurch organization, getting vision for this ministry, and then taking that back to the church, or whether you see that more playing out as the conversation starts in the church, and then from there, they start looking at opportunities that can fulfill that.
Does the church feel like they want to have a stake in where this person is serving?
I would say in my experience, both from the church side and from talking to people, that we encourage them that it's never too early to invite your church into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, we want them to celebrate, with you when you each kind of step along the way that you feel like, oh, there's greater clarity, which is being brought into this. And, you guys were walking beside me, and praise the Lord for that. Also, some churches have, strategic partnerships. They're saying, yeah, we'd love for you to go overseas. Here are the 3 organizations that we work with that we feel like align with our values and or our theology or whatever that might be. It's rough when somebody goes through this whole process and then the church says, oh, we don't partner with them because they hold this position.
Right.
And that happens. And so it's helpful to cut that off at the pass, so to speak, but just earlier engage the church with saying, who are you comfortable, with me engaging to serve and do this? So, we tend to reach out to a church as soon as somebody fills out a form that they intend to come to a exploratory kind of week on our campus. And we just say, we reach out to the pastor and we just say, hey, can we talk to you just for 5 to 7 minutes? And we just say, hey, we're so excited this person is coming from your church. We just wanted to know, have they reached out to you? Do you know that they're coming? Because we want you to be a part of this process. That's just an introductory conversation. So for those that are going, I think people maybe that sometimes we're a little shy. We're like, oh man, I'm almost embarrassed to tell my pastor that I want to be a missionary, or I want to be a campus mobilizer, because they know who I was when I was in 6th grade, and they're never going to be. So it's like, but I think, that churches are often really thankful that the Lord is using that church to raise up people to serve the Lord in different ways.
Right. What are some of the obstacles that prevent church and parachurch from really synergizing well?
Yeah, there's ways to which the parachurch is unique, and other ways to which the parachurch can feel like they're doing the same work as the local church. And so when that distinction isn't drawn, it's hard for a church to say, oh yeah, we want to support that, as opposed to them saying, well, why don't you just join in what we're doing? We're already doing those same efforts.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big challenge. I would say another challenge is that often a church cycles through who leads their outreach ministries with some regularity. That might be every 5 years or every 4 years. It seems like there's a new missions pastor or a new outreach pastor. And so the vision for what the church wants to do can shift with that. And if somebody's going to be working through a parachurch organization for a long time, a church relationship takes more work than an individual relationship, because they have to maintain that relationship, understanding who one another are and what each other are doing, where usually somebody is an individual that's supporting you, their heart for how they involved in outreach doesn't shift significantly over a course of 4 or 5 years like a church does.
That's where it feels really strategic to have that Barnabas team or that core team or that advocacy team that is more fixed, and that maybe you have like somebody who plays that advocacy role and can still keep you connected to whoever happens to be in charge at the moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in terms of communication with your sending church, whether your team has any recommendations for your sent missionaries, or, when you were a pastor, whether there were any kind of hopes or expectations, or what you desired to see, maybe a cadence of hearing from your sent missionary. I'm just curious whether there are any considerations for partnering and communicating with your church that might differ from the way you communicate more broadly to your full partnership base.
Yeah. So what's, I think, unique with most churches is that they're usually led by committee. So I find it really helpful to say, with our, Zoom and other kind of technologies that are available for you to connect on that level, of saying, hey, is there a committee meeting this year that you would love me to give like a 15 or 20 minute update and ask any question? Because the committee often changes as well, to where there might be the same kind of lead person, but who else is on it might change. And so that's something I encourage people to reach out to, especially on a lot of people, some of their supporting churches, they're not as close with, maybe they have a church as their primary sending church that they've been a part of that sends them out. But then also the church they grew up in when they were a kid,
Right.
supports them, or their aunt's church supports them. And it's harder to maintain those relationships because it's kind of hinged on the relationship with one person they have within that church. So a invitation to share to a meeting, I think is fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe for people to just have in view that their church likely has committees that are meetings, and that's a really great space to pursue trying to be seen at. Yeah, that's helpful.
What do you, and maybe you've already touched on this a little bit, but I think it's significant, maybe just in a broader kind of perspective. Occasionally, there are people in our networks or people that we know even that we would say are strong believers, but they aren't really connected to a local body at all. COVID hit, they got used to virtual church, and that kind of has become the new norm. Like, this is a big discussion, really, that we maybe don't have to get into the depth of it, but what's the significance? What's the importance of really being sent by a local church?
That's a great question. I think there's one, which is there's a sense to which, as believers, we're called into a community. So whatever work that we're doing outside of the place that we're coming from, like, we want people to be formed into communities of believers together.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so hard for people to live a life of, I'm the only person that believes in my city. How do I keep pressing on unless we have that community to doing the one another's, with each other? So I hope in one sense it's like something we're trying to model to the people that we're going out to. So I think that's helpful. There's some practical reasons that it's really helpful to be sent from a church. One is just broadening our network.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the different people that we're connected to, for whether that's care or fundraising. There's other types of ways that broader networks help. Like, for example, when I was opening up a business, I hadn't done this before. I hadn't opened a business like I was trying to do overseas. And the church helped me connect with different individuals that had different types of skills that could speak into the work that I was doing, that really benefited my ministry because of the church connections. Another way that was really helpful was like we needed to homeschool for a number of years. And there was a great amount of resources of people that we could reach out to because we never homeschooled before. They could tell us of their pros and cons of, the material they were using, to how their kids responded, to the types of breaks that they needed. Those kinds of broadening of the networks was really helpful from coming from a church. Another thing that churches like to do is to come on a visit. And that's super, it can be really encouraging to your hearts of kind of showing off the place that you live and things you can be proud of and things that you learned. And even though your language teacher tells you you're terrible, in front of them, you look like an expert, and you're like, oh man, I really kind of boost my self-esteem because people can't speak, any of this. But in front of them, I'm a master of this language. And so some of those types of things can be a process of an encouragement to an individual that a church can provide that they wouldn't have if they weren't being sent out of a church congregation.
That's great. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, a lot of those connections, making connections for the homeschooling space or making connections for that business venture, did that just come through very direct conversation with your church and with maybe your advocacy team or advocate there, or were those more just kind of like needs you put out in general and your church was just very responsive?
It was more of a direct ask.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was communication with our, primarily not to the church as a whole, but to the missions pastor of the church, identifying this, like, this is what I'm looking for. This is what we need. Sometimes it was just people we already knew that were from within the church, but I could think of, we had a church plant that we had started in the Middle East, and we were saying, man, we don't have anybody that can lead music. And I remember asking the mission pastor, I said, hey, is there anybody that could come over for 6 months to kind of just help us while we kind of get this thing off the ground? And he says, well, this is a little strange, but I know just the guy. And there was a university student who said, yeah, I can take next semester all my classes online. And he moved in with us for 7.5 months and really helped, our church kind of, as we began forming, into a regular gathering, to kind of get off the ground. It was really, really beautiful.
Wow.
Very
Awesome.
cool. Yeah, I love that. I guess, Drew, as we kind of close our time out, I'm curious from your own experiences, pastoring, living on support, raising support, now working with helping churches partner with your sending agency. I'm just curious what encouragement you would want to provide to our listeners or any recommendations for resources you would have.
Yeah, I don't know if I have unique resources that probably you guys haven't shared with your listeners already, but one of the things I love about raising support is there's so many times where it's like, how is this going to work out? And we actually have to lean in faith.
Yes.
And pray in faith. And then once we reach those goals, to step back and say, hey, the Lord did this. In my own strength, I was like, I don't know how this is going to happen. But there's a very unique opportunity to really lean on the Lord in faith and actually to see him deliver. That's, I think, a privilege to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Do you have any way of reflecting on things you've asked him for and leaned on him for that he's provided?
One of the ways it's really helpful for me as a remembrance of the Lord's faithfulness is because we send out prayer letters. And it's always a point when I'm writing a new one, I send them out quarterly because it's been a long time and things don't change really quickly when you've been on support for 15 years.
Right.
But I look back and say, wow, that was just 3 months ago. And I was asking people to pray for this. And here we are. And then I look back to 6 months ago and I said, oh, wow, the Lord really provided in this way. So that's such a great, unique opportunity of saying, hey, what am I about to ask the 300 people on my email list to be praying for? You have to be really intentional about your ask. And then the privilege of being able to look back and say, oh, yeah, look at that. Praise the Lord for that.
Yeah, cool. I like that.
Yeah, that's good that there's so many kind of obligatory moments throughout the year where you have to go back and do that. I think that's something that, your average Sunday church going Christian doesn't have the impetus to do unless you're really, really intentional to really think about what the Lord has done for you. That's kind of a benefit of being on support, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I have the final question then.
You got it.
For Drew today. All right. So, hypothetical situation, you have suddenly $10,000 to give away. You have just a few seconds to decide right now, who or what do you give it to?
Yeah, that's an easy one for me. I think if I had $10,000, there's a ministry I really love called Arab World Media. And what they do is they kind of create digital campaigns to bring awareness of who Christ is and what he's done, what that means for them. And people connect in and they have online responders that just kind of ask and answer people's questions about Jesus. And they invite them into online Bible studies. And from there, if they want local follow-up to connect local believers or, expatriate people that are in their community that can talk them about walking with Christ, then they make these connections to people that are in their town. It's weird because you can actually just run the numbers and the research on it would say that $10,000 would lead to 80 people joining a Bible study.
Oh,
and
wow.
That's a really, really cool thing to say, hey, that's a very tangible way that I'm giving to this. I'm supporting Christian workers in this part by bringing them people that are interested in learning about Jesus. And it's kind of all set up for them ready to go. So I really love that work.
Very cool. What part of the world do they work in? Are they in some countries and not others? And
yeah, they work all across the Middle East primarily, and then a little more into Europe, spilling into Europe as well. So they release most of their materials in Arabic, and so it kind of narrows down the areas that they work. But they have people that are responders that are in places like Lebanon or Egypt, but also that some people that live full time in the UK or even Brazil. Like I remember they have somebody who's in Brazil. I was like, why do you have somebody in Brazil? They're like, well, everybody's sitting on their phone late at night, and thinking about these deep questions. It's helpful to have somebody on the other side of the world who's their daytime that can be responding and answering and giving them scripture to read and to consider and to pray through. And so, yeah, I think it's a really beautiful ministry.
Yeah, nice, and that kind of a nice subtle covert way to get into these places that are really quite closed.
Exactly. And it's like people have questions, but they struggle to just come out and say, hey, I want to know more about this.
Right.
But they're going to sit on their phone in their room and, go online and ask questions that way. And so this is a way they can spend their time considering Christ's claims, without feeling like it's putting themselves at risk in the meantime.
Very cool. Well, we'll have to link that in the show notes.
Yeah, Airworld Media. That's great. Well, Drew, thank you so much for joining us on It's Not About the Money. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness to speak into what we think is really a very important element of being a healthy support-based worker.
Yeah, very valuable. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.